how our first listed cannabis company smoked its chances of success, and what it means for the rest of the industry's high hopes.
We're in revenue now after all these years of development. This is the big frustration for everybody. I mean, I'm still the single biggest shareholder in the company. To get to this point, to get so close, it's just heartbreaking for everybody. But that's business, unfortunately.
It's Friday the 19th of April, and you're watching Markets with Madison. Cannasouth was the first cannabis company to list on our market under the ticker name CBD. Now it's in voluntary administration and its shares have been suspended. It tried to get investors high on a trailblazing industry, but it seems all they got was a bad trip.
Mr. Hopton, what are the effects of the marijuana drug?
The effects of smoking marijuana.
Taking marijuana from the black market to mainstream medicine. This is the sunrise industry listed companies like Cannasouth, Real Bioscience and Greenfern are behind. There's around 40 companies with a license from the Ministry of Health's Medicinal Cannabis Agency, set up to regulate the system made legal in April 2020. Licenses vary for different activities, with rules allowing products with CBD and THC, like dried flower and oils, to be manufactured or imported and sold domestically. And demand for it has been growing, with 266,700 patients saying they use it in the NZ Health survey last year. But only 6% of them use legal means to access it, meaning the actual market is not that advanced. All of our listed cannabis companies are currently loss-making, and their share prices show it. Investors initially got excited about the recreational prospects these companies could profit from, but a referendum rejected it. Cannasouth claims it was only ever into pharmaceuticals. It was only one of 2 companies with full GMP certification from seed to sale, but its plan to be the largest local supplier has failed to flower. Ex-Chief Executive Mark Lucas resigned last week after the company was placed into administration, just months after it started making money. In his first interview since, he reveals what went on. Well, Mark, I appreciate you doing this. As we've spoken about just before, this isn't easy, but you are brave for being here, so I appreciate your time.
You know, look, I appreciate the opportunity, and it was certainly not the type of circumstances I would have wished to have these conversations, but you know, there's a lot to unpack in this industry and Cannasouth's journey, and I think I welcome the opportunity to have a bit of a chat about it and hopefully just clarify a few things for people.
Let's start on that clarification point. What actually happened? Cannasouth is now in voluntary administration. Who called them in? How did it get there?
Well, ultimately, the business has been cash constrained for quite a period of time. We've made that clear to the market that, you know, the business was cash constrained. We've been under an aggressive restructuring process, reducing costs out of the business. The thing with cash is that it doesn't lie, and when you get to a certain point with cash in the bank, directors have a responsibility. They don't have any choices in that regard. They have to go down a certain route. So we've been working hard to get some additional funding into the business, and we were getting very close to that. But ultimately, you know, when you get to these pressure situations, you need alignment between, you know, fresh money that's coming in, existing debt, and in this case, convertible note holders, and broader than that, some of the big shareholders. If you don't have that alignment, then you know, it's difficult, and some of that new money won't come in. So we got to a point where literally the cash was in a position where we had to sort of you know, draw a line basically. And
were you in a negative cash position, or did you just see
no,
the
we
runway
had
out?
We had cash in the bank. We just had to get to that point where the directors had to act in a fashion that meant that the business did not run out of cash.
You tried to raise $5 million in a convertible note and rights offer late last year, twice. You tried twice. Directors were supportive of that, but what was the actual funding gap that was still required?
Well, I mean, we were developing business plans to get us through to the end of the year. I'm not going to go into the exact figure that the funding gap was, but you know, we had our pathway to do it. Still a lot of barriers to overcome, but ultimately, you know, you need your big shareholders and the note holders behind you to be able to do that. we couldn't get that alignment in time, and so unfortunately this is the position that the business is now in.
Just a bit more detail on that misalignment.
Yes.
Did directors want to try and raise again? Did they want to look at other avenues to fill that funding gap? And then were there directors that refused to? What was the conversation?
I mean,
that was
ultimately
happening?
we had some funds that were prepared to come into the business, but convertible note holders, that requires security. Convertible note holders have some rights in that particular interest, and so we needed those two things to come together, and they just couldn't come together in time, unfortunately. So, you know, the note holders need to come on the journey. They get certain rights with that type of debt facility. And yeah, we just ran out of time to get that alignment, unfortunately.
Okay, so voluntary administration, it's not in liquidation,
Correct.
nor receivership. But what does this mean? Do you think it can continue? What are the conversations that are
Yeah,
happening
well, I mean,
now?
ultimately, I think there's a lot of people invested in this business and believe in it. We've created a significant beachhead in a very fast-growing market here in New Zealand, and with good access into Australasia. So there is a massive amount of value that's been built up. This boils down to a funding gap. We're in revenue now after all these years of development. This is the big frustration for everybody. I mean, I'm still the single biggest shareholder in the company. To get to this point, to get so close, it's just heartbreaking for everybody. But that's business, unfortunately. It's a hard world out there. We've got a lot of economic and financial, headwinds. We just need to get that funding gap bridged so that the business can move forward. Administrators now have to come in. They've got the control of the business. They've got the ability to fast track cutting additional costs that were, not necessarily levers that were available to the current management team. And ultimately now it's about getting some kind of proposal brought forward, and I've certainly got my fingers crossed that proposal means continuing the business on in some reduced format so that ultimately value can be returned back to shareholders.
Is that you personally being hopeful, or do you genuinely think it could continue in some
Well,
way?
I think the business units are stood up now, and when you strip, the costs out that we've actively been undertaking that process, aggressively stripping costs out since the merger happened. So look, it's, there's so much opportunity there. The big challenge in this business is ultimately getting to the start line. The time and investment it takes to build compliant facilities to, that are pharmaceutical GMP standard, to then take products and get them verified, to get them onto the market is just unbelievable, and to finally actually be there and have that revenue coming in. And as I say, now it's a case of saying how fast can we ramp that revenue up? How quickly can you reduce costs down, simplify the core activities to real key commercial objectives, and then ultimately fund that gap. And that's what hopefully the administrators will be able to get a proposal that enables that to happen.
Yeah, you were so close. You expected to be cash flow positive by the end of this calendar year. As you mentioned, that revenue ramp, you finally got your products commercialised. You sold about $500,000 worth of them in the last 3 months of last calendar year. So you finally had commercial revenue coming in.
Yep.
Was it too little too late though?
Well, unfortunately, I think every company that's come into the space, the regulations that basically underpin this whole industry, wherever you go, the regulations and the regulators themselves are having to understand a whole new medicine type. And so the time it's taken to actually navigate that process is significant. And ultimately, 6 months, if we had products verified 6 months earlier, there's a lot of working capital that gets chewed up with a business of this type in 6 months. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. I'm not here to sit and blame the regulators or the regulations per se. They're just one of the challenges that these businesses have had to overcome. So at the end of the day, that's right. I mean, I think the business has turned over roughly $1 million of revenue since those products have been launched into the market, and the market is growing rapidly in front of us. So, again, that's the frustration. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. But cash is king. If you don't have the cash, you can't keep the lights turned on.
Yeah, and speed to market matters in this industry, doesn't it? Do you put that solely down to regulation, or do you also admit that Cannasouth's operations were not ideal and you could have got there faster?
Well, there's no shortcuts in pharmaceutical development. The process is the process. To develop compliant facilities, especially building them from scratch is a process. It's expensive, it takes a long time. Then to develop the products, develop stability data so that you've got shelf life, there's just a massive amount of detail that goes into these things. Of course, if you could get products to market further and earlier, absolutely. But ultimately, once you get to the market, you've got to say, what is your product? Do you have a defendable position? Is there some margin within this product as well? And so, ultimately, the reason that we merged two companies together was because we were unlocking some of the development work that had been done, not to just get into market with products, but also to be able to get into products with markets that could be very competitive. We've already done that. The products that we've brought to the market here in New Zealand, we've come in and been very, very cost competitive and picked up market share quite quickly, because that's a promise that we made to patients as well. Ultimately, we want to bring these products forward and we want to make them more affordable for patients as well. So, it's not just about getting to market, it's about, have you got a defendable position when you get there? And we believe we do and we have, but ultimately, again, if you don't have the working capital to actually fulfill the potential of the business, then that's a big problem. And ultimately, what we've done is effectively built pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities, and then we've brought the first products to market. But the next wave is the pipeline of products that sits behind that. We have a pipeline of products that were going to be brought forward over the coming months and years.
And were those, sorry to interrupt, but were those products that were grown and cultivated in New Zealand, or were they imported products like many others are doing?
Yeah, our products are actually, we had been importing some products earlier on, but the products that we're developing were manufactured in New Zealand. And that puts us in a unique position. We're able to supply those products direct from our facilities directly into pharmacies and the supply chain in New Zealand. Yeah,
every player in this medicinal cannabis game tells me that the market is growing, that there was massive growth up to around 266,000 patients in the, but only about 6%, 16,000 odd of those patients are actually accessing that medicinal cannabis through the legal regime. So what was the mission effectively for companies like Cannasouth to transition more of those people onto the legal market?
Yeah, well, I think, if you look at Australia, which is a bit more advanced, you'll see that, generally speaking, your average general practitioner or doctor out there is still not necessarily convinced about medicinal cannabis. You've got a huge population of people that are using medicinal cannabis from the black market right this very minute. And so it is about transitioning those patients through, providing them, firstly, if a prescriber is not prepared to write a prescription, then where does the patient go? If they go and talk to their doctor and their doctor says, look, there's not enough evidence, I'm not going to write you a script, they can't get the product. So, the way that the Australian market and what's happening here in New Zealand has been developing is specialist clinics. So you've got doctors that are trained in using and in prescribing medicinal cannabis. They know what conditions it can be used to treat, and so they provide the patients a much easier way to access those medicines. And so that's the key to unlocking. The next part is price. Ultimately, the biggest supplier of medicinal cannabis in New Zealand is the black market. And so once the price of and quality is better than the black market, and there are actually prescribers that are willing to actually write a script, then you create critical mass. And if you see what's happening in Australia, they've long reached that inflection point, and New Zealand is on that road here as well.
So the problem is prescriber resistance for the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, your average...
Is that fair, though, to blame doctors for not prescribing it just because you want to supply it?
Well, I'm not saying it's... that's just a bottleneck for patients. It's real, it happens. And most prescribers, of course, if they don't know enough about these products, of course, they're going to err on the side of caution. That's just their responsibility, that's their right. But I mean, what I'm saying is effectively by the rise of these specialist clinics, that with actual trained doctors in the space, the patients are able to actually access these medicines. So what happens is, as a patient goes through that journey and then they go and tell their friends and family that you can actually go and get these medicines now, there are prescribers out there that understand them well enough to write a prescription, then the critical mass grows and grows, and that's when you see the exponential rise in prescription numbers, which is what we're seeing right now.
The demand picture I find forecasting is interesting because it's quite unknown, it's quite uncertain. There's a real lack of data, even between the users. People don't really know how much of that is recreational or is medicinal.
Yep.
You told investors of Cannasouth in an investor call in November, late last year, that you expected the market to potentially double over the next 12 months. But other than Australia and other markets where it perhaps has been legalised or decriminalised, like Canada, where are you getting that information from?
Well, Australia again is the classic example. You know, there's plenty of data out there that shows the growth in medicinal cannabis in Australia. In Australia, people get confused about cannabis, recreational cannabis, Canada, all these different markets because they're all different. So the only real, Australia is the best guideline that we have because they follow the same type of process. You need to go to a doctor, the products need to be of pharmaceutical quality, the doctor writes a prescription, you go down to the pharmacy and get it. All of the other markets all have different nuances. So the growth is undeniable in Australia. You can look at the growth here in New Zealand and you can see it following the same trajectory. So, it's if you go and talk to specialist pharmacies that are focusing in on this area, generally the biggest problem they have is amount of space in their safes to actually lock all these products up. They have to get a bigger safe and a bigger safe and a bigger safe. So, that demand is real. As an industry, one of the big challenges that we have is getting real data out of the agency. And when you're a manufacturer and you're trying to weigh up, should we be targeting this export market? How much of our production capacity should we be focusing on the New Zealand market? You do need data. And it's a challenge that the industry in general here in New Zealand has been struggling with for some time. You've got to piece together bits of, incomplete data to get the picture. But then, as I say, if you drill down and you actually speak to, anyone that's on the ground, you can see the growth there in front of your eyes. So, very convinced in the growth potential of the industry here. And, we're in the infancy of cannabinoid-based medicines.
Without knowing the numbers though, does that not mean that this entire industry is operating on a decent amount of blind faith?
Well, you can see the numbers. So we released just recently some of the information that had been released by the agency that show those prescription numbers. So that's enough there to show you. And then when you start to see revenue, for example, we had to take some of that data and make some estimates before we were in market of how much demand that we were likely to see. When we came into market, the demand that we were seeing is what we were expecting. So, I'm very confident that the demand is there and it will continue to grow at a rapid rate. As long as the clinics can continue to keep up with the demand of new patients that they're starting to see, and products can meet the patients' demands.
I know you want Cannasouth to continue operating, but worth $32 million, if it does go under, doesn't continue to operate, what does that mean for the industry?
Well, I mean, obviously none of this is good news for the industry. Cannasouth has been a leading light out there. We've sort of, it puts pressure. The industry is under pressure. If you look at, a lot of sunrise industries that are have massive growth potential, you go through a typical development curve. You go through the hype of expectation, and and then you come into the trough of disillusionment, and then ultimately, you start to climb out of that once the dust has settled and the companies with the good strategy, actually go on and survive, and then they attract the next round of investment that takes the businesses through into the next phase. We're starting to see green shoots. If you're looking at Australia again, I keep going back to the Australian market because it is more advanced. There are plenty of companies that have struggled. The capital markets, any companies that are listed have been really struggling, but you're starting to see companies turn the corner now, starting to generate significant revenue, starting to head towards profitability. And ultimately that's the next phase of the industry. And the same will happen here as well. And I'm certainly, I'll cling to the hope that, Cannasouth in whatever shape or form can continue on and fulfill its potential. But the industry itself is not going anywhere. It's only going in one direction.
You mentioned the word hype. And on the topic of investors that have supported Cannasouth through its journey, when you listed, you were the first medicinal cannabis company to list
Yep.
in 2019. That was before the 2020 recreational referendum.
That's right.
How much hope do you think Cannasouth sold to investors, or perhaps had in its own mindset internally, about the potential for recreational use and what that would mean for Cannasouth and the industry's prospects?
Well, I think if you look back at everything we ever put out, we've always made it very clear that we are we're a medicinal cannabis company. That was where we were focusing. We believe in the potential, and not only just the unlocked potential, but the existing demand for, medicinal cannabis. So, of course, people see recreational cannabis. It's developing around the world. We've seen Germany just legalise recreational cannabis. The US looks like it's moving towards federal legalisation. So, of course, people will make their own assumptions about if you're in the medicinal space. We've never been able to control that, but I still stand behind, if you go back and look at everything we've talked about, that we've been focused on medicinal cannabis because we believe in medicinal cannabis and what it can do for patients. And we're pioneering a new industry. And in the fullness of time, when the dust settles, these companies are pioneering a new industry. The medicines themselves are not new. They go back in the pharmacopoeia. They were prescribed before, a range of reasons took them out of favour. They're coming back. But ultimately, this is a sunrise industry. The challenges for companies that operate in the space go across the board. Simple things like opening bank accounts, getting insurance. There is so much stigma and dogma around cannabis that it just creates barrier after barrier after barrier. And, Cannasouth and others within the industry have consistently bashed down each one of those barriers over, again, this is the true frustration, is that, we've sort of overcome every barrier that's been put in front of us. Unfortunately, the hard school of life and business means that despite all of that, you can still trip on the final hurdle, and that's what's happened.
If you don't mind me saying, Mark, you're holding it together pretty well. For somebody who just had to exit a company that you've spent years building, how are you going?
I'm very frustrated. This is not about me. I have led this organisation the best that I can. The buck has to stop somewhere, and when you're in a chief executive role, it stops with you, and I accept that, I accept that. Ultimately, all I want is what is in the best interest of shareholders now, and I'll do everything in my power to sort of, because we're backed by over 20,000 shareholders that have actually backed the business and backed what we're doing. I still stand behind what we've created, the industry itself and the opportunity. We're just at that final hurdle, and it is very frustrating, but I appreciate the ability to actually tell the story. It's a complex story. People jump to all sorts of conclusions around the industry, but you just need good information, and so, but I do ultimately hold myself accountable.
I agree with that. We love information. Should someone acquire Cannasouth? A competitor, perhaps?
Well, I think everything's on the table. The administrators will be looking at that. I'm sure other competitors would be looking at the position that we've created, and I know if I was on the other side of the fence, I'd be having a good look at what we've created, because I think it has significant value. The beachhead that we've created can be leveraged, and I mean, if I was them, I would be looking at it pretty strongly. I'm hopeful that a plan can be put together that doesn't mean that the business is split up, but ultimately, for me, it's about shareholders now. It's about what delivers the best return for shareholders that have been on this journey, and that's what I'm focused in on. Of
which you are one. How much do you own?
I think I'm about 8% of the business. I'm the single largest shareholder still. I've sold a few shares over the years, but very, very few. I've committed to the business and haven't, and I believe in it. So this is a big blow for me as well. But that's business, unfortunately.
Well, I wish you the best of luck, and keep me updated on where it goes from here. Thank you so much for your time, Mark.
No worries. I appreciate the time.
When I called Mark and asked him to come on the show and tell you what went wrong, he did not hesitate. It takes a certain level of humility to front up like he did. And while I appreciate the honesty, I know that it does not actually bring back investor funds. So here's hoping that will be sorted out in time. If you were one of the 20,000 shareholders backing Cannasouth's prospects, let me know. Now go put your money to work. Thanks for watching Markets with Madison, the New Zealand Herald show for interested investors. If you want to stay up to date with financial markets, click the subscribe button below and you can watch our other episodes here. Stay up to date with all the business news and numbers as they land on nzherald.co.nz.